think one part which I think is clear in the document, right, is the move away from the focus on inputs. So I think in different ways, I think there are different terms which are used in the NEP, but I think largely the key message through various sort of phrases and terms which are used is that we need to focus on primary safety, right? Some basic concerns about the minimum disclosure norms that the schools must have, right? And I think beyond that, in terms of whether the school should have a playground of that size or a classroom of this square feet, right? All of them would be much more locally decided and will be, in a sense, open for local decisions to be made on those, many of those parameters, right? So I think it's clear that the RTE key emphasis or key belief of the RTE, right, if you think from that point of view, was that if you create right kind of a school as defined by RTE, the education would happen. Right? The fundamental premise of the RTE, right? That you create a building of this kind, library of that, playground, a lab of this kind, teacher with these qualifications and training, right? Once you got all of the input right, you will get education done, right? That's how RTE thought about achieving quality education. You can sympathize to some extent, okay, yes, given diversity of India, how do you make sure that the school which is in Delhi is very similar to one which is in Bolangir? And therefore we are providing equitable access, right, to school education to children across the country, right? I think what RTE missed is it's not the infrastructure that creates quality learning, right, is actually what happens in the classroom, right? I think that part, the focus on the outcomes and learning was completely missing in the RTE. Actually, I remember the debate on RTE, people pointing out the learning outcome as a phrase does not even appear in the whole act, right? And so I think hopefully that is the fundamental problem that was with the RTE. Hopefully that will get resolved as we move forward with the way the NEP is thinking about learning outcomes and focus on outcomes as opposed to on inputs, right?
So I think one big change that we might also be seeing, or we should at least be asking for, is that the name of the act itself, right, moves from the right to free and compulsory education, switches to right to quality education, because that's the goal for all of us, and quality education of choice. So I think that's one big, sort of sentiment, if I were to pick on. So, in fact, we started thinking about this when the Kasturirangan Committee report came out, and we even drew out a blueprint on what should this regulator look like. One thing I must congratulate also the cabinet, right, is just the name has switched from regulator. The original recommendation was State School Regulatory Authority. It has switched to State School Standards Authority. This in itself, in a way, conveys sort of intent and purpose. But this is not sufficient, far from sufficient. It's a start. You first need to be very clear what is the objective in law of these agencies at the state level. So this will require a lot of thinking and crafting. We've put out some recommendations in our agency design blueprint. In addition, just the composition, right? How you compose, what is the board management structure of this authority? What is the mandate of the authority? What is the guidance from the legislature on what the authority can do and not? These all have to be articulated very clearly using the instrument of law to the extent possible. So that's one. The second is measurement metrics, right? How will you measure the performance of a regulator? So what is the kind of metrics that are useful? That gives you another way of being able to hold them accountable and to avoid regulatory capture. And the third is, I also think that this idea that, again, the NEP brings in is accreditation, not just sort of one size fits all regulation, but saying that a school can choose to be affiliated and accredited on different parameters from different agencies. This is what also allows this kind of mixing and diversity to emerge. And my sense is that these three big things will help us get closer to the kind of outcomes we have in mind when we think an independent agency.
That was a point I think Bhuna was trying to make in terms of the next steps, right? This is a change, the independent standards authority, for example, or a regulator, right, is currently on paper. What would matter is how it is being designed, how are the people staffed to run it, right? So all of those, I think, questions still remain very much open. And that is a work that the CCS research team has been doing for quite some time, looking at the regulatory agency design, right? And that, of course, would come to play in terms of the question that you asked earlier about regulatory capture, right? The capture would depend more substantially on how the agency is designed and how the people are selected to run the agency, right? I think I don't have as much worry about regulatory capture in education, because I think there are tens of thousands, if not lakhs of schools, right? Even private schools, right? And it's difficult for any group of them to be able to turn the system in their favor and against other lakhs of schools, right? And therefore, given the number of schools that exist, the diversity that exists, and which I assume would even expand even more with the more open field being given under the open schooling system, right? It's going to less and less likely to have a few dominant players in the sector who could then capture the regulator. Right? So I think just the sheer diversity and numbers gives you a little more confidence that that is unlikely to happen, or it's not as easy to do as it could be, say, in some other sectors like telecom, for example. Well, I think you were asking a question earlier about what I dislike about the NEP. And I think that is one of the top thing on my list is the number of exams. Right? There's an exam at a grade 3, class 3, 5, 8. Right? There are sort of third-party exams. I assume they are not the exam conducted by the school. Somebody else would conduct those exams, right? So class 3, 5, and 8. And then there are board exams at the class 10 and 12, right? So you've got pretty much 5 independent third-party exams happening in the 12 years of schooling, right? Then we have aptitude test. The new National Testing Agency would conduct this aptitude test for entrance to colleges, which you can also, it's not clear that would that be only one test like the SAT, or would there be multiple kinds of tests depending on which field you want to go, engineering or medicine or others, right? So you can see the number of exams which are being put in place, right? And I think every Indian parent and student knows how detrimental that has been, even the board exam that we have currently in place without having the grade 3, 5, and 8 exams in addition to that. Now, I'm trying to understand the logic behind this, right? You can see what is maybe the possible driving force, right? So people have the sense that they can't do much with the teachers and teacher accountability, right? You can't really change that part of the education system, given sense people have in terms of power with teacher unions. Right? Now, what can you do then, right? So the other route is to then conduct these exams and keep showing the picture, in a sense, how bad or good the performance of the students is, right, to the teachers, and maybe use that mirror in a way to put pressure on the teachers, motivate them in some sense to do better, perform better, right? So I think the number of exams are a shortcut or a different route to accountability of teachers, right? Since we are not able to walk the straight route of accountability, given the political economy of teacher unions and their power, right? And my sense is that that is a shortcut that is not going to work, right? We have seen this happening in many other countries, particularly in the US. The US tried very hard to put national standards, right? No child left behind act that they had, right? And they thought that by putting these national standards and the assessment based on those standards would then bring out how the schools are performing, and that would then put the pressure on the teachers to improve the performance, right? But what we saw is that even the assessments are now thrown away. Teachers question the assessment themselves, right? Yeah. Do this assessment make sense, right? And as you can see, the debate has evolved over the last 10 years or so in the US. Those assessments are now thrown out, right? They are pretty much back to square one where they started. So my fear that this increased focus on exams is a shortcut for better performance of teachers and schools, but that I think is not going to be achieved. We are just going to put more pressure and burden on the students. And I don't want to say this, but the more suicides and more harassment in that sense, right? That is going to follow because people are going to be disappointed by the performance in these exams, and which will be like known to everyone in a sense. It's a sort of third-party exam. And so I think that I see as the biggest lacuna or a missing point in the NEP is the focus on teachers. I don't mean that we need to punish teachers. I think that's not really the point at all, even though sometimes people use the phrase teacher accountability as teacher punishment, right? But that's not really the purpose, right? I think we have to figure out how do we motivate teachers? How do we align to the national mission of education, right? And that alignment, that motivation, that drive to do something for the country, for your community, right, has to be there among the teachers. And that cannot come just by showing them exam results. Oh, not at all. That certainly is one argument we would not be able to make in case of India, right? The teacher salaries, as you know, in many cases, they are like, in UP, for example, they're like 20 times the per capita income of the state. So average person in UP, the income that person has, compared to that every teacher in UP, government school teacher we're talking about, government school teacher in UP, has an income which is 20 times more, right? There's just no way one can argue the teacher salaries are low, right? I'm sure there's an international comparison also done by some years ago by UN that shows Indian teachers are one of the highest paid in terms of per capita income of the country, right? So you take the average income, average salary of the teacher in government schools and compare that with the country's per capita income, the ratio is highest in case of India.
So teachers are
it's
quite
not about the salaries, that there's something more is missing. There's something more is missing.
Just this idea, right, the of proliferation of exams. I of course don't have kids, so I don't worry about that question very much. But having suffered back when I was a student, I think one big issue, and I don't know how we solve this quite clearly, is that a school environment is meant to be, sort of a place of interaction between parents, children, and the school management. Taking the system view has meant that we have increased the number of eyes on children versus the number of eyes on some other parts of the system. So how did we go from that kind of local interaction to this kind of systemic interaction? That worries me personally, right? That a school should be able to figure out the frequency of exams, should be able to figure out what works in terms of content of exams, or the severity or the sort of repercussions of those exams on those children. That should have been really a discussion at the school level. For us to have taken it out and magnified it in this level, that I think is a little bit scary, if you ask me.
And just to complete that, we already have a NAS, yeah, right? The National Achievement Survey and the State Achievement Surveys, which are going to be conducted regularly, right? To give us a sort of health checkup of the system. And we will know how the system is doing through those tests. We don't really need to have so many other tests to build into the system, which is just going to create more tuition classes, more pressure on kids, more pressure on parents, right? And that's going to drive again away from real learning, right? It's going to be exam focused training, right? You can imagine that incentive for the teacher and the school, right, is to design your learning towards doing well in the exam, because that's what people are going to be watching at, not just at class 10 and 12, but now at class 3, 5, and 8. I think our CCS recommendation was that very similar to what happens in all other sectors, right? The schools will announce its openings or vacancies, right, at the school level. Right? You can aggregate that at the state level for the government schools, but it should be known when I apply for a job, and I'm applying for a job to be a science teacher for, I don't know, say high school, in a school in Bolangir, right? And that's where I'm going to go, right? So I think one fundamental change that is required in teacher appointment is appointing teachers at the school level. You can have assessment standardized and centralized, but appointments should be happen at the school level. There is a sort of line in the NEP which says that teacher transfers would happen only for reasons of promotion, meaning that you're getting promoted, right? Or maybe from teacher to a principal, right? Going in that different line of management in a way. I don't know. It's not very clear how that's going to play out. There's not much clarity in terms of what's going to happen with teacher transfers. The transfers can be addressed only when you address the appointment, right? So appointment has to be at the school level. And once we begin to do that, as it happens in all private schools, right? A DPS, which is, let's say, chain of schools, doesn't advertise openings at the DPS level, at the chain level. It's advertised at the school level, right? Each individual DPS announces his openings at the school level. So I think teacher transfer is a huge issue. I think that's part of what I was referring to in the teacher motivation, right? It's not exam results which is going to motivate them. You have to address all of the systemic challenges which are there for teachers. You think from their life point of view, and their life is not easy given all the things we have put in place.
A lot of these questions and issues are also really about school autonomy, right?
Yes.
Public school autonomy and private school autonomy, of course, we're tackling with the regulatory reforms. But in the case of public school autonomy, and my sense is that NEP has not done, sort of a lot of hard work on altering this. How do I, and this also relates to the localization question, is my local school, how do I make decisions which are right for my student population, for the parents who are coming to my door, for the kinds of teachers that I can attract, for the kind of revenues that I'm able to sort of earn, right? That is still sort of a box which I think we're much too afraid to touch. And some of the transformations, as Parth mentioned, come at that school level.
My reading is, and this is maybe a more optimistic reading of the text in the NEP, is that basically by putting those options, local language, mother tongue, regional language, right? What NEP is trying to say is that schools would have the autonomy to choose the language of instruction, right? Now I know that there's a lot of research which indicates, not just in India, but across the world, that mother tongue, and this of course is a very interesting question, what mother tongue is in a household where father and mother come from very different language backgrounds, right? But keeping that aside, whatever the mother tongue is, whatever the language of the house is, right? We know that it matters a lot in the initial years. The child is taught in that language, right? Here, I think we should keep in mind is not Hindi. Mother tongue for most people in North India is not Hindi, frankly, right? Even though it's an official language, which is different than mother tongue. I think there's a lot of confusion around this, right? So Bhojpuri and many such dialects or languages are actually mother tongues. Hindi comes much later in many cases, right? We know in most tribal areas, there are many different tribal languages which are the mother tongue and not the official language of the state. So Odia is not the language for all the tribals in Orissa, right? So I think so my sense is that mother tongue is important, and I hope that the NEP keeps that option open for schools to decide as part of their decision to what's contextually relevant for the kids that they are serving, right? But I think, of course, there is also pressure. We know part of the BJP sort of political group which focuses on Hindi being made as a national language, right? So it will be interesting to see how this dynamics, which is internal to the political party, right, to the ruling party, is going to play out in practice. My hope is that most local leaders and politicians are much more savvy. They have the ear to the ground. They will know what people really want, and hopefully they will find a way to make sure the people get the education in the language they choose for the children.
So there are two parts to this language question, right? One is the medium of instruction, and the other is the choices that children have in schools in terms of learning multiple languages. And I think there is some sort of level of confusion and concern on both of these. On the first, like Parth said, a decision and a choice or a negotiation between a school and a parent. And for a national, sort of to take a national view on this worries me deeply, particularly because it ends up getting the force of, sort of restrictive law in a way, right? So how we step away from it is going to be really important. choice of languages, we're already seeing some debate around Chinese being taken off the sort of menu of options available to parents and so on and so forth. Again, this is something that we should, it doesn't hurt us, and it certainly doesn't hurt us if we want to be a global player and a global sort of relevant player as a country, right? That our children speak a multitude of languages, are competent and able to conduct business in them. This is the long view of it, and I wish the policy would not, sort of hinge itself on today's politics for tomorrow's reality, right? This is a really interesting sort of development, right? 1 year ago, when the Kasturi Rangan Committee report came out, it devoted a lot of space to discussing both RTE as well as 12(1)(c) in particular, asking for a comprehensive review, saying that reimbursements need to happen and so on and so forth. Even the early draft of the NEP that we saw a few weeks ago had some mention of RTE. This current final draft does not talk about sort of reforms in RTE specifically, and not as much about the 12(1)(c). In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it doesn't mention 12(1)(c) at all. This, I think, is a missed opportunity. This was, sort of a good way to have made that directive. When it comes to the question of, say, COVID, so 12(1)(c) problems were even pre-COVID and, sort of legacy issues, right? But now you put it in the context of budget private schools and COVID. I think when we look back and say that, listen, if we had opened this sector up to private registration, meaning that schools could be registered as private firms, they would have had access to the COVID MSME package, right? That itself would have given them both bridge financing to get over difficult times, but also get, sort of temporary assistance that they would have passed on to parents. So really, we have, sort of cut our nose to spite our face in it, right? And my sense is that this is all interlinked and comes in, sort of comes together in very dire ways, if that makes sense. But the policy itself does not talk about how you cope.
It's an important miss in the policy. Maybe there is no consensus within the government, and that is reflected on the fact that is not being addressed in the policy itself. But it's not, the problem is not going to go away. The need for a decision on that is not going to go away, right? Just by not discussing it in the policy document, right? I do, at one level, I do agree that there is a need for some way of bringing inclusion, given the diversity and differences that we have in terms of class, caste, religion, right? And so I think, and we know that many private schools have been doing it on their own, right? It would have been good for the government to make it voluntary and reimburse those schools on time and in sufficient amount that becomes a positive incentive for a school that I want to bring in a child who is of a different background, right? I think many educated parents also understand that need if it is done in a proper way, right? As opposed to being run down the throat by the force of the law as it is being done. And we know that in many schools, children are being badly served by being in those schools who don't want them in those schools, right? And so I think my sense is that a rethink on 25%, not to completely abolish it. So I do see there is a need for an incentive for schools, particularly private schools, to bring in people from diverse backgrounds, students from diverse backgrounds, and that could be actually positive incentive. And it can be, school can be recognized, rewarded, awarded, right? You can do many, many things to incentivize schools to become more diverse, more reflective of their own locality, right? In that sense, right? And I think that is an important area of inclusive education, which is, I think, missed in this policy document.
So I think 2 or 3 big things, and we're very fortunate because in the last 20 years of, sort of, in the early years being the flag bearers, or at least the only people talking about this kind of thing, over the last 20 years, we've managed to bring many people onto our way of looking at the world, onto our way of looking at the system. So there are many folks now who are chiming in on the same song, which is great. So one big focus for us is working with all of these different partners and providing the kind of either evidence, support, technical sort of research, technical understanding, and saying that take this message forward, right? There are several different groups like this that we hope to do this sort of consistently and systematically with. In terms of work portfolio on the education front, I think there are directly sort of taking the work of or the intent of NEP into implementation, right? So the first is how do you, the question that someone else asked, how do we design robust agencies that, correct the incentives, that don't fall prey to the same kinds of problems that other government departments form. So just the regulatory architecture design as well as the agency design, how do you do that correctly? So that's one big focus area. The second is, of course, the Right to Education Act. How do we use this opportunity to make the right to quality education, right? We've been doing a lot of work already with Niti Aayog as well as with other partners on consolidating the sort of regulatory chaos at the state level. The states are, sort of the prime movers in that sense, right? And in this particularly consolidating, simplifying, and coming up with one model state school code that states can then adapt to their local realities, but also working with states and saying that what will work in your context, or so on and so forth. So these are three big things, and Parth, maybe you want to talk about the other two as well.
Yeah, I think other is just, I think, building the, the idea of let 1,000 flowers bloom. How can you create that possibility within the system? And I think there is just no doubt in anyone's mind that given the diversity of India, we need to have many, many diverse models of education. One single model is not going to deliver what we expect for all our children, right? So I think strengthening the NIOS, right? Making it a reputable sort of assessment. Right? Currently, the certificate that you get or the exam that you pass from NIOS is not seen as as good as CBSE, right? In terms of and of course other international boards, particularly so. So how do we make sure that NIOS performs its role in a way so that the certificate from NIOS for class 8 or class 5, right, or class 10 and 12 is of equal standing, right? So just because I did not follow a particular path of education, sort of followed by many in the country, my certification should not have a low value, right? So how do we design a system of NIOS that brings that high credibility and reputation for that certification process, right? And that's a very important part. And that, I think, would strengthen the desire and capacity of people to do different modes of education. Once they believe that my child can go to any system that I think is best for education today, but would get a certification for class 5, say, and then go to a regular school later on, or class 8, or whichever one that I choose. So I think that will be a very important part of, I think, design and working of the NIOS. And the same would apply at the state level, right, for local language education. I think both of those are going to be very important to build this multiple pathways to nirvana, let me put it that way. Right?
Yeah.
And the last, obviously, is most obvious one, right, that we need to continue to do what Pratham has been doing for rural India. We need to expand that to urban India, which is as big as rural India now. In that sense, right? So I think we need to make sure that we're able to measure those learning outcomes in an effective, transparent, accountable manner, disseminate those learnings, right? And I think it's clear in the language of the policy that it is not seen as a punitive measure. It's seen as a development measure. We want to use this information to develop, to improve, and what we need to do, understand that, right? So I think building a whole ecosystem around learning outcome assessment, right? What do we assess? How do we assess? And how do we use that information effectively, not just at the national level, but also not at the state level, but also at the district and the school level, right? I think that will be important part of what we need to do moving forward to make sure that our commitment to 21st century education for all of our children, we are able to keep that commitment.